So you've been saying after this for longer than you realize. It's not once, it's not twice, really for years. It's been different versions. It's been in different circumstances and for sure with different deadlines. But the same promise, once this passes, things will settle. And they never do. Because after this isn't a timeline, it's a holding pattern. Holding patterns don't evolve themselves on their own. This episode is about the story you've been telling yourself and how long you've been believing it. You know what? Let's do something that most men resist. Let's actually map the timeline, not theoretically and not abstractly. And let's walk backwards through the last few years and see what you've actually been saying. So think back to 3 years ago. Are you there? What were you telling yourself then? Now, take a second and actually think about it. What was the explanation you were using for why things weren't aligned yet? All right. Did that sound something like, once this project launches, after we get through this transition, when the kids are a bit older, once I get promoted, after we finish this build or this move, this investment, whatever it was that you said. And here's the thing, you believed it. And why? Because the circumstances were real. The pressure was real. The deadline was real. And after this felt like a reasonable timeline. You weren't lying to yourself. You were looking at the reality in front of you and making a logical prediction. Once this specific thing passes, I'll have space to address the other things. Now let's move forward 6 months from that point. You're 2.5 years ago now. Did it settle? Did you get margin where you were expecting? Or did the next thing show up before the last thing resolved? So for most men, the answer is pretty clear. A new project showed up, a new crisis, a new responsibility that needed his attention. And so you updated the timeline. Not because you were wrong about the first thing ending, but because the next thing started before you could catch your breath. Now, let's move forward another 6 months. You're now 2 years ago. What were you saying then? Was it the same promise, just with different details? Once this quarter closes, after we get past this busy season, when things stabilize at work, it's the same structure, just different circumstances. So now let's move forward one more year. You're 1 year ago from now. You're now 2 years into this timeline that we've been mapping. What's changed? Not the circumstances, because those are always different. But what changed about the pattern? Did you get the margin you were waiting for? Did things settle the way you thought they would? Did you finally have the space to address what you'd been deferring? Or did after this just become after the next thing? And then after this next thing, after that. Now, let's move forward to 6 months ago. What were you telling yourself then? Was that explanation different? Or was it the same story, but just with updated details? Let's move to 3 months ago. And then let's move to last month. And so here's a critical question for you. What are you telling yourself now? Right now, today? Is it the same story with just updated new details? And I think if you're honest, you've been saying the same version of after this for 3 to potentially 5 years. And the only thing that's changed is the excuse. The circumstances change, the deadlines change, the specific pressures change, but the pattern doesn't. So here's something for you to consider. Write down the last 5 times you said, after this. No, seriously, actually take some time right now and write them down. What has actually changed after each one? It's not about what you hope it would change, but what actually changed. And this is the reason why this pattern is so hard for us to see. You see, the explanation always feels true in the moment, doesn't it? Because you're not lying to yourself. You're not actually making excuses. The pressure is real, the deadline is real, and the crisis is real. And so the logic follows that once this specific pressure passes, I'm going to have space to address the other things. That logically makes sense because it's reasonable, it's rational. Here's what I think you're missing. Your life is structured to generate the next pressure before the current one resolves. And it's not because you're doing something wrong. And it's not because you're bad at planning. But because that's how high capacity lives work. You're capable, and people depend on you. You deliver. And so the next thing always shows up. Always. The project after this project. Crisis after this crisis. The responsibility after this responsibility. You're not waiting for the work to finish. You're waiting for a version of your life where all the pressure resolves at once, and you finally get the space to address what you've been deferring. But here's the sad truth. That version just doesn't exist. Never existed. And it's not going to start existing next quarter. Because margin doesn't appear when the work is done. Margin is created by deciding what doesn't get to be urgent. By deciding what doesn't deserve the label of crisis. It's by deciding what you're going to address even when circumstances don't force you to. And most men just never make that decision. They just keep waiting for circumstances to change. They keep waiting for a less busy season, for a less demanding phase, for a moment when everything aligns and they finally have the bandwidth they've been waiting for. But here's the reality. If you're capable, people will give you responsibility. If you're reliable, people will depend on you. If you deliver, people will ask you to deliver more. And that's not going to change. The only thing that changes is whether you decide to create margin or keep waiting for it to appear. So I have a question for you. What would have to be true for you to actually have the margin you're waiting for? Be specific. Not theoretically. Let's actually think about what would have to change. Would you need fewer responsibilities? Would you need less capable performance? Would you need people to stop depending on you? Would you need your career to plateau? Because if the answer is any version of less responsibility or fewer demands, you're not waiting for margin. You're waiting for a different life. And that life isn't coming. So let's consider what something temporary actually does. It gives you permission to defer. It's not in a manipulative way, and it's not in a dishonest way. It's in a protective way. If this is temporary, you don't have to address it. You just have to endure it. If this is temporary, the gap doesn't reflect on you. It reflects on the circumstances. If this is temporary, you can tolerate things you would never accept as permanent. Things like distance from your spouse, disconnection from your kids, absence from the things that matter most. Because temporary means this isn't a real situation. Because the real situation will show up after this. Because this is just a phase. And this is just a season. And this is just what's required of me right now. But here's the problem. What you're calling temporary eventually becomes normal. Not because you choose it, and not because you decided this is how I want to live, but because people adapt to the pattern that you create. Your spouse stops expecting your full presence because your partial presence is just the norm. She doesn't complain about it anymore. Not because it's fine, but because complaining didn't change anything. So she adjusts. She builds a life that functions without requiring your full engagement. Your kids, they just stop bringing things to you because you're not actually available, not physically unavailable, not emotionally unavailable, mentally unavailable. You're there, but you're not present. And they learn that. They learn what's worth bringing to you and what isn't. They learn to handle things on their own, not because you're teaching them independence, but because you're not available for dependence. Your own internal standards adjust because enduring is easier than changing. You stop noticing the gap. You stop feeling the dissonance. You just accept that this is how it is. And what you thought was a season now becomes a climate. What you thought was temporary becomes the structure. What you thought was just for now becomes just how it is. And so here's another question for you to consider. What have you been calling temporary that has quietly become the way you live? Not in theory, in practice. And so what patterns have you been explaining as just for now that's been running for so many years? What gap have you been tolerating as temporary that actually become permanent? And so here's what the pattern is costing. Whether you're measuring it or you're not, it's time you can't get back. Not time at work, that's accounted for. That's what you're being paid for. I'm talking about the time, the people who matter, while you're still the version of yourself that they need. You see, your kids don't stay young while you wait for margin. They don't pause their development while you get through the busy season. They're forming conclusions about you right now, about what matters to you, about what kind of man you are. And it's those conclusions that are being formed by your pattern, and it's not your intentions. You see, your spouse doesn't stay engaged while you stay distant. She doesn't wait in suspended animation for you to finally have bandwidth. She adapts. She builds a life that works without you being fully in it. Not because she wants to, but because the alternative is waiting indefinitely for a version of you that never shows up. See, relationships that you're deferring don't pause. They just adapt. And it's that adaptation that isn't the same as health. It's just what happens when people get used to less than what they need. The influence erodes. It's not dramatic and it's not sudden. Just a slow shift from being the person people turn to being the person people work around. You're still respected. You're still valued. But you're no longer the person that they bring the real things to, because they have learned you don't have the space for the real things. You have space for logistics, for problems, and for crisis, but not for the deeper conversations and not for things that don't have clear solutions. And so they just stop bringing those things. And you don't even notice because nothing's broke. Nothing's failed. People have just adjusted. It's that clarity that you lose. The longer you defer this directional decisions, the harder it's going to become to know what you actually want. Because you've been in reactive mode for so long that you've forgotten what proactive looks like. You've been managing through circumstances for so long that you've lost the ability to create circumstances. You've been enduring for so long that you've forgotten to feel what it's like to actually choose, what internal integrity looks like. It's the gap between the man you say you are and the man you're actually being. That gap doesn't stay private. It shows up in how people see yourself, in how you lead, and how you show up when it matters. Because you can't compartmentalize integrity. And you can't be one version of yourself at work and another version at home and not have those versions bleed into each other. And the thing is, this isn't catastrophic. It's cumulative. And cumulative erosion is harder to see, but it's just as real. Because it doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates. It's year after year. After this, after this, after this. Until one day you wake up and realize you've been saying the same thing for 5 years and not changing anything. And here's what changes if you stop calling this temporary. You stop waiting for those circumstances to give you permission. You actually start creating the margin that matters. And it isn't going to be by doing less, and it's not by lowering your standards, and it's not by becoming less capable, but it's by deciding what gets to be urgent and what doesn't. By deciding what deserves the label crisis and what doesn't. By deciding what you're going to address, even when the timing isn't perfect. You stop tolerating drift because it's just for now. And you start addressing it because now is all you actually have. You don't have after this. You have now. And if you're waiting for after this to address what matters, you're choosing to let it drift now. That's not a circumstance. That's a decision. And you stop deferring those conversations that matter. And you start having them, even when the timing isn't perfect. Because the timing will never be perfect. There will always be something else happening. There will always be another project, another deadline, another pressure. And if you're waiting for that perfect time to have the hard conversations, then you're waiting for a time that doesn't exist. And so you have them anyway. Not perfectly, not comfortably, but you have them. Because deferring until perfect just means deferring indefinitely. And you stop treating your personal life like something you'll get to eventually. And you start treating it like it deserves the same rigor you bring to everything else. The same intentionality, the same discipline, the same refusal to let important things drift because they're not urgent. And this doesn't really require massive change. It doesn't require burning everything down and starting over. It doesn't require quitting your job or moving to the mountains. It requires naming the pattern and acknowledging that after this has been running for years and deciding it no longer gets to run unchallenged. So let's bring this all the way home. You've been saying after this for years, and after this has never arrived. Not because you haven't worked hard enough, and not because circumstances haven't shifted, but because the pattern doesn't resolve itself. It just repeats with new details, new projects, new pressures, and new explanations. But it's still the same pattern. And so at some point, calling it temporary stops being description and starts being denial. It stops being an accurate assessment of circumstances and actually starts being permission to avoid what you know that needs to be addressed. And you know this. If you're being truly honest, you've known it for a while, haven't you? And so the question isn't whether you're willing to stop pretending. You don't. Whether you're willing to call this what it is. It's not a busy season. It's a pattern. And patterns don't change because you explain them. They change because you decide they're no longer acceptable. And so here are a few questions that I'd like you to sit with. How many more years are you willing to say after this? What are you waiting for that isn't coming? And what would change if you stopped waiting? Not someday, but right now. What would change if you decided that after this is no longer a valid explanation? That the time is now. Not because circumstances are perfect, but because you decided it is. This isn't a busy season, it's a pattern. And patterns don't change because circumstances improve. They change because you decide they're just no longer acceptable. So the question isn't whether you're busy. You are busy. That has never been in question. The question is you're willing to let busy be the reason you defer what matters most. Because eventually, after this, becomes never. Not dramatically, not intentionally, just practically. And you keep saying after this, and the years keep passing, and the pattern keeps running. And one day you look back and realize you've been saying the same thing for 5, 10, maybe 15 years. And guess what? Nothing's changed. Not because you didn't have good intentions, but because you kept waiting for circumstances to give you permission. And the thing is, circumstances never do. You don't get those years back. So the band of brothers is where men stop waiting for margin. It's where they start creating it. And if that's where you're at, you know what to do.
Thank you for listening to the Revolutionary Man podcast. Are you ready to own your destiny? To become more the man you are destined to be? Join the brotherhood that is The Awakened Man at theawakenedman.net and start forging a new destiny today.